Forget everything you think you know about the ceasefire that was supposed to be holding between Israel and Iran. Because what happened in Beirut last night is not a violation of the rules. It is a declaration that the rules no longer apply. And by the time I am done walking you through what this strike means, why it happened now, and what Iran's response tells us about where this conflict is heading, you are going to understand exactly why the fragile pause that has been keeping this war from exploding back into full-scale hostilities just shattered. Israel struck Beirut's southern suburbs yesterday evening, targeting what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu described as the commander of Hezbollah's elite Radwan force. This was the first Israeli airstrike on the Lebanese capital since the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah took effect on April 17th. And that timing is the entire story. Let me be absolutely clear about something before we go any further. I spent decades in military intelligence, analyzing targeting decisions, escalation dynamics, and the strategic logic behind when governments choose to cross thresholds they had previously respected. And what Israel executed last night was not a tactical strike driven by immediate operational necessity. This was a strategic decision made at the highest levels of the Israeli government, coordinated in advance with the United States, designed to send a message that has consequences far beyond the streets of Beirut. Within hours of that strike, Iran paused commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, not as retaliation for the Beirut attack specifically, as a response to what Iran described as ongoing Israeli violations of the ceasefire in Lebanon. The same violations that culminated in last night's strike on the capital. The same pattern of behavior that Iran has been warning would trigger exactly this kind of response. The war that was supposed to be frozen is not frozen anymore. The escalation ladder that diplomats spent weeks trying to climb down is being climbed back up. And the decisions being made in Jerusalem, Tehran, and Washington right now are not about managing a ceasefire. They are about managing the resumption of hostilities that nobody officially wants to acknowledge has already begun. Now, let me explain what actually happened in Beirut and why the location matters as much as the target. Because this is where the strategic calculation behind Israel's decision becomes clear, and where the consequences start to extend far beyond one airstrike. Israeli warplanes struck the Goberi area in Beirut's southern suburbs, a predominantly Shia neighborhood that has historically been a Hezbollah stronghold. The target, according to Israeli officials, was a Hezbollah commander responsible for attacks on Israeli forces in southern Lebanon. Netanyahu and Defense Minister Israel Katz issued a joint statement confirming the strike and stating that the Radwan force commander had been responsible for attacks on Israeli communities and soldiers. Here's what makes this strike different from everything Israel has done in Lebanon since the April 17th ceasefire. Beirut was off limits. Not officially, not in any written agreement, but in the operational reality that governed Israeli military action for the past 3 weeks. Israel continued striking southern Lebanon. Israel continued operating in what it calls a security zone, extending up to 10 kilometers into Lebanese territory. Israel continued targeting Hezbollah positions, weapons depots, and command nodes south of the Litani River. But Beirut, the capital, the population center where hundreds of thousands of civilians live, had been treated as a different category. The understanding, unspoken but clearly observed by both sides, was that strikes on the capital represented a level of escalation that neither Israel nor Hezbollah wanted while diplomacy was still nominally active. Last night, Israel crossed that line, and the decision to cross it was coordinated in advance with the United States. An Israeli source confirmed to CNN that the strike had been discussed with American officials before it was executed. That is not a detail. That is the entire geopolitical framework of what just happened. The United States brokered the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah on April 17th. The United States has been mediating negotiations between Iran and Israel. And the United States just gave tacit approval for an Israeli strike on Beirut that breaks the understanding that had kept the Lebanese capital off the target list. If you are watching this and you have not subscribed yet, do it now. Because what I am about to walk you through, the strategic logic of why Israel chose this moment to escalate, is something the mainstream media will not explain with the precision it deserves. Now, let me take you inside the contradiction that defines this entire crisis, because understanding this contradiction is the key to understanding why the ceasefire was never actually holding and why it just collapsed completely. President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have stated repeatedly that Lebanon was not included in the ceasefire agreement. Trump said explicitly that Hezbollah was not part of the deal. Netanyahu echoed that position. Iran and the Pakistani mediators who helped broker the ceasefire have stated just as clearly that Lebanon was included, that halting Israeli attacks on Lebanon was a core Iranian demand. Both cannot be true. The answer is that the ambiguity was deliberate. The ceasefire was constructed with enough flexibility that both sides could claim compliance while doing exactly what they intended to do anyway. That arrangement, unstable as it was, could be sustained as long as the level of violence stayed below certain thresholds. Israel could strike Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah could fire rockets and drones at Israeli forces operating in Lebanese territory. Both sides could claim self-defense. Both sides could accuse the other of violations, and diplomats could continue pretending that the ceasefire framework was salvageable. Striking Beirut crosses a threshold that makes that pretense impossible to maintain. You cannot claim a ceasefire is holding when one party just struck the other party's capital for the first time in 3 weeks. The ambiguity that allowed the fiction to survive does not stretch that far. In Iran's response, pausing commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz is a direct signal that Iran is no longer willing to accept the arrangement. If Israel is going to escalate in Lebanon, Iran is going to escalate in the Gulf. If the ceasefire framework allows Israel to strike Beirut with American approval, then the framework has failed, and Iran is returning to the leverage it controls, which is the ability to disrupt global energy supply. Before I continue, if you found this analysis valuable, share this video. Share it because the mainstream media is reporting the Beirut strike as an isolated incident, a tactical operation against a Hezbollah commander. They are not connecting it to the Strait of Hormuz, to the ceasefire framework, or to the larger pattern of escalation that just restarted. Both stories exist. Only one explains what happens next. Hit that share button. Now let me show you the operational pattern that led to last night's strike, because this did not happen in a vacuum. This is the culmination of 3 weeks of increasing friction that was always going to produce exactly this result. Since the April 17th ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, Israeli forces have remained in southern Lebanon. They have not withdrawn to the border. They have established what Israel calls a security zone extending up to 10 kilometers into Lebanese territory. Israel says this zone is necessary to prevent Hezbollah from reestablishing positions near the Israeli border and to ensure that Hezbollah cannot threaten northern Israeli communities. Lebanon and Hezbollah say the continued Israeli presence in southern Lebanon is itself a violation of the ceasefire, which was supposed to involve Israeli withdrawal and the deployment of Lebanese army forces to maintain security in the south. As long as Israeli troops remain on Lebanese soil, Hezbollah argues, Lebanese resistance is justified self-defense. The friction produced by that fundamental disagreement has been escalating daily. Hezbollah has been using FPV drones, small commercially available quadcopters retrofitted with explosives, to attack Israeli forces operating in southern Lebanon. These drones are cheap, difficult to detect, and capable of inflicting casualties even against well-protected forces. Israeli soldiers have been wounded in these attacks, in some cases killed. Israel has responded by striking Hezbollah positions throughout southern Lebanon. On Saturday, just 3 days before the Beirut strike, the Israeli Defense Forces announced that they had hit approximately 70 military structures and 50 Hezbollah infrastructure sites. That is not a ceasefire. That is active combat operations conducted at a scale that would qualify as war under any other circumstances. And throughout this escalating pattern, Beirut remained untouched until last night. The question every analyst should be asking is, why now? What changed between Saturday, when Israel was content to strike targets in southern Lebanon, and Wednesday, when Israel decided that Beirut needed to be hit? The target does not explain the timing. Hezbollah commanders have been operating in Beirut throughout the ceasefire. Israel could have struck the capital at any point over the past 3 weeks if eliminating this specific commander was operationally urgent. The timing suggests a strategic decision, not a tactical one. And understanding what that strategic decision was requires looking at what else was happening in the hours and days before the strike. Iran was in the process of reviewing the latest American proposal for ending the war. Multiple sources confirmed that Iran was expected to deliver its response to mediators on Thursday, 1 day after the Beirut strike. President Trump had said publicly that the U.S. and Iran were having very good talks, that progress was being made, that a deal was possible. And then Israel struck Beirut with American coordination. That sequence is not coincidental. There are 2 ways to read that timing. The first is that Israel struck Beirut despite the diplomatic progress, risking a deal that was close to completion because operational necessity demanded eliminating a high-value target regardless of the diplomatic cost. The second reading, the one that makes strategic sense, is that Israel struck Beirut because of the diplomatic progress, that the prospect of a deal that would constrain Israeli action in Lebanon was precisely what motivated the decision to escalate now, before any agreement could impose limits that Israel does not accept. Netanyahu has made it clear repeatedly that he views Hezbollah as an existential threat that must be neutralized, regardless of whatever broader agreements are reached between the United States and Iran. If a diplomatic framework was emerging that would freeze the conflict in place, that would prevent Israel from completing what it views as necessary operations against Hezbollah, then the strategic logic would be to act now, to strike a high-value target in a high-visibility location, and to establish facts on the ground before diplomacy can impose constraints. That reading is consistent with everything we know about Israeli strategic doctrine. It is consistent with the pattern of behavior Netanyahu has demonstrated throughout this war, and it is consistent with the American decision to coordinate the strike rather than oppose it. If the United States wanted to preserve the diplomatic track, it would have told Israel not to strike Beirut. The fact that American officials approved the operation in advance tells you everything you need to know about whether Washington actually believed a deal with Iran was imminent or desirable on the terms being discussed. Iran certainly read it that way. Within hours of the Beirut strike, Iranian media reported that Iran had paused commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz in response to ongoing Israeli attacks in Lebanon. Not just the Beirut strike specifically, but the accumulated pattern of violations that the Beirut strike represented. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a statement saying that, with new protocols in place, safe and stable passage through the strait would be ensured once the attacks on Lebanon stopped. That is diplomatic language for a very clear message. As long as Israel continues operations in Lebanon, Iran will continue disrupting global energy supply. The leverage Iran holds over the Strait of Hormuz is the leverage Iran uses to impose costs on Israeli action in Lebanon. That connection, the link between what happens in Beirut and what happens in the Strait of Hormuz, is the geopolitical architecture of this entire conflict. Israel cannot operate in Lebanon without consequences in the Gulf. The United States cannot support Israeli operations in Lebanon without accepting those consequences. And Iran cannot maintain its regional influence without defending its allies in Lebanon, even at the cost of global economic disruption. This is not new doctrine. This is the same leverage dynamic that has governed the conflict since February. What changed is that for 3 weeks, both sides pretended that dynamic could be paused, that Israel could operate in southern Lebanon without triggering responses in the Gulf, that Iran could tolerate Israeli operations as long as they stayed below certain thresholds. The Beirut strike proved that pretense could not hold. The threshold was crossed, and Iran's response, immediate and calibrated, demonstrated that the leverage dynamics are back in full effect. The ceasefire was an attempt to pause that dynamic, to create space where Israel could stop striking Lebanon, Iran could reopen the strait, and diplomats could construct a framework that addressed the underlying issues. What last night's strike demonstrates is that at least one party, Israel, with American support, has decided that framework is not acceptable, that the constraints it would impose are worse than the consequences of continuing the fight. And once one party abandons the framework collapses for everyone. Now let me tell you what happens next, because the decisions being made in the next 48 to 72 hours will determine whether this conflict restarts at the level it was operating before the ceasefire, or whether it escalates to something worse. Iran has paused traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. That is not the same as closing it entirely, which is what Iran did in the immediate aftermath of the February 28th strikes. Pausing traffic suggests Iran is signaling displeasure and imposing costs, but leaving room for de-escalation if Israel changes its behavior. Israel has not changed its behavior. Israeli officials have made it clear that operations in Lebanon will continue, that Hezbollah remains a target regardless of ceasefire frameworks, and that the strike on Beirut was justified and may be repeated if operational conditions warrant it. The United States is attempting to maintain the fiction that diplomacy is still viable, that talks with Iran are progressing, that a broader deal is possible. But every statement from American officials is contradicted by American actions, specifically the decision to approve the Beirut strike that undermined the very diplomatic process those officials claim to be advancing. Iran is reading those contradictions clearly. The proposal Iran was reviewing before the Beirut strike is almost certainly no longer under serious consideration. Iran's deputy foreign minister said publicly on Saturday that the ball is in America's court to choose the path of diplomacy or confrontation. The Beirut strike, coordinated with Washington, is America's answer. If you have stayed with me through this entire analysis, you understand something that most people scrolling past headlines do not. You understand that the Beirut strike was not an isolated tactical operation. You understand that it represents a strategic decision by Israel, approved by the United States, to abandon the ceasefire framework rather than accept the constraints that framework would impose. And you understand that Iran's response, pausing traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, is not an overreaction, but a calibrated signal that the leverage dynamics that govern this war before the ceasefire are back in play. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, because the war that was supposed to be winding down is ramping back up. The decisions that will be made in Jerusalem, Tehran, and Washington over the next few days will determine whether we return to the level of conflict that existed in March and early April, or whether the escalation goes higher. The ceasefire is not holding. The unspoken rules are broken, and the signal being sent by all parties is that the pause is over. What comes next depends entirely on whether anyone in a position of authority understands that tactical victories in Beirut do not compensate for strategic failures in the Gulf, and that the cost of continuing this war is measured not just in lives lost in Lebanon, but in the economic disruption of closing the Strait of Hormuz to a global economy that cannot afford it. The strike happened. The response came. The war restarted. And the only question that matters now is how far it goes before someone decides the cost is too high to continue. Subscribe, share, pay attention, because this is not ending quietly.